students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 202. Today, we are going to talk about William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, a very important scholar and American and leader. So he had a long and complicated life, which I'll tell you all about, and he wrote a lot of very incendiary things, which I will also tell you all about. So, let's get started. So, here he is, W.E.B. Du Bois. He lived a really long and really interesting life. As you can see, he was born in 1868 and didn't die until 1963. So he lived through a lot of really crucial pieces of history, especially for Black Americans. So over the course of his life, he did so many things, so much actually that he wrote 3 autobiographies. But he was sort of privy to a lot of things that were happening in terms of a first-person viewpoint. So he was a founding member of a lot of important organizations, and he had an excellent education, and he wrote a lot of really important pieces. So his place in history is vital. So let's start with his education. He was very well educated, especially for his time period, and especially for his race. So first he did his BA at Fisk University, which is an HBCU, a historically Black college and university. But he wanted to also go to Harvard, and Harvard didn't accept his credits from Fisk, so he had to do a second bachelor's at Harvard. After that, he wanted to do a doctorate, but Harvard didn't typically take any Black men. In fact, they hadn't taken really any yet. So he went abroad to the University of Berlin, did a lot of his PhD work there, and then came back to Harvard, where he finished his PhD. He was, in fact, the first Black man ever to be awarded a PhD from Harvard. After this, he took a research position in Pennsylvania. And I wanted to bring this up because even though he was only there for a little while he was there, he did this really important study that was sort of foundational for sociology. It was called the Philadelphia Negro, and basically what he did was invent a lot of ways to study a population. So he mapped the blocks, he mapped like birth and death rates, he mapped what businesses were where, and essentially by using all of this data, he was kind of able to prove what was going on with the Black population in Philadelphia and how their lives were different in like manageable, quantifiable ways. So he was one of the first people to like introduce data to the race problem, and that was a really important contribution. Next, he came to Atlanta University, which still exists, but these days it's called Clark Atlanta University because a couple of different colleges merged. But it was also one of the first HBCUs. And so while he was there, he served as a professorship of history and economics, and he was important. He was one of the big teachers there. He taught everybody while they were there. He published a lot while he was working there, but he was also not entirely happy, so after a little while he left and was a founding member of the NAACP. In fact, he was the person that suggested that the word be colored rather than Black or Negro or something else, because he wanted to be clear that it wasn't just for Black people, it was for all the essentially non-white Americans. So he was one of the founding members, and he was also the editor of their newsletter, which was called The Crisis, and a lot of editions of that do still exist. But eventually he got tired of that too, and he went on to have a whole series of later adventures. He came back to Atlanta University for a while. He traveled all over the world. He was part of big research in terms of whether Black men could serve in the Army or whether anyone should serve in the Army at all. He was drawn up in the whole McCarthy thing. In fact, the day that they were supposed to have his trial in terms of the McCarthy trials, Albert Einstein said that he would be his character witness, and the jury basically was like, never mind, he's good. Such a good character witness. So eventually he became interested in Pan-African scholarship, and he traveled to Africa back and forth a lot, but he was there when he died. And incidentally, he died the day before the March on Washington, the one where Martin Luther King made his really famous speech, and so they had a moment of silence for him at that march. So his lifespan was massive, of course. He was almost 100 when he died, but it also covered some really key parts of American history and ended right as the next civil rights movement was beginning. So the piece that we're going to talk about today comes from the book The Souls of Black Folk, which is actually 14 different essays kind of worked in together. So this is also foundational. This is one of those pieces that pretty much everybody reads, including you, and it's considered one of the most important works, especially in like African American scholarship and in sociology. But as you can imagine, when it came out, it was on the one hand a huge hit, and on the other hand, very scary. So for instance, here are 2 different reviews. In the first, from the Nashville Banner, This book is dangerous for the Negro to read, for it will only incite discontent and fill his imagination with things that do not exist, or things that should not bear upon his mind. So for some people, they thought it might be an incitement to violence, or it might let people know what was really happening, or it might keep people from not thinking about what was really happening. The New York Times had a slightly softer review. A review of the work from the Freedmen's Bureau from the Negro point of view, even from the Northern Negro's point of view, must have its value to any unprejudiced student. Still more, perhaps, for the prejudiced who is yet willing to be a student. So the New York Times was basically saying, maybe we should all read this. In fact, maybe the most prejudiced among us should read this. It has a lot of valuable things to say. So in a sense, these two reviews were saying the same thing. They were both saying, this man is speaking the truth, it's a little scary, but the New York Times was the only one saying, and maybe it should be scary. So another thing that I wanted to talk about before we get started was this idea that DuBois kind of introduced, which has since become really critical, especially to the African American experience, and to literature, and even to films. So that's the concept of double consciousness. And on the one hand, this is something that all humans experience. We all have different facets of our personality and of our experience in life. But what he's talking about, and what Ralph Waldo Emerson was not quite talking about, was this specific experience of being both Black and American. So this is something that people have been dealing with recently in terms of movies. You may have seen Us or Get Out, and there's a lot of really interesting articles about how they're also trying to figure out how double consciousness works in a modern setting. So I wanted to read you Du Bois's idea of what it is, because I think it's incredibly powerful. Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem? One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much soul to teach the world in Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. So again, I wanted to bring this up because it still is. This is exactly still something people are dealing with. This is exactly still something that we're looking at on the national stage. So this was one of the key ideas that Du Bois brought forth in the world, and it does show up over the course of this piece, even though it's much more prominent in other pieces. So I wanted to sort of bring it up so you had a frame of reference, because it's going to be one of those sort of thoughts, one of those theories that we'll have to talk about as we work on this piece. So we are reading Chapter 3 of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others. And I imagine you've heard of Mr. Washington, but I am going to go through and explain some of the things that Du Bois references. So he begins, easily the most striking thing in the history of the American Negro since 1876 is the ascendancy of Mr. Booker T. Washington. And he's right. Mr. Washington was very important. So here he is. He lived from 1856 to 1915, so their lives overlapped, and of course they knew each other. But he was also a very important figure on the political scene and on the educational scene, and really a lot of pressure was put on this one man to be a sort of representative of his race. So in dealing with him, Du Bois was dealing with one of his contemporaries, one of his comrades, someone he really respected. And a lot of this piece is about that. How do you criticize someone you respect, someone who is important? So Booker T. Washington is going to show up over and over the course of this piece and over the course of this lecture. But the things that he did that were especially important were the founding of Tuskegee University, which we'll talk about, the Atlanta Compromise, which we'll talk about, and the founding of the Negro Business League, which was a huge thing during Reconstruction. So he was a big deal, and that's why he's talking about him. To gain the sympathy and cooperation of the various elements composing the White South was Mr. Washington's first task. And this, at the time Tuskegee was founded, seemed for a black man well nigh impossible. And this is true. Imagine asking someone to gain the sympathy and cooperation of the entire White South by themselves as a black man, especially as a black man in this period of time. So when he was talking about the founding of Tuskegee University, this is what he meant. It was actually established in 1881, so like really close after the end of the Civil War. And it does still exist. It's still a very famous and prestigious school. And it was founded as a teaching college. And that's something that we're going to see over and over in the course of this piece, because they needed to make a way to teach teachers so that they could educate the black population. So Tuskegee was one of the first universities that did that. Then DuBois goes on to talk about what Washington had just done that was making him so mad, and that was the Atlanta Compromise. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the five fingers, and yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So the idea here was that in some ways they could be entirely separate. They could have separate neighborhoods and schools and restaurants and movie theaters. And in other ways, the things that were essential to mutual progress, they could come together. And what he's talking about here, the Atlanta Compromise, was part of a speech that Washington made in 1895 in Piedmont Park. There's a marker there still if you want to go. And it was never really formally written down, and it was never really agreed upon. But the compromise that Washington was suggesting was basically that the black citizens would not ask for the right to vote, and they would not retaliate against racist behavior, in exchange for which they would get free basic education, either vocational or industrial, they would get peaceful segregation, and they would get due process under the law. So, you might be thinking to yourself, that's a terrible compromise. And you're right, that's a terrible compromise. And that's what this piece is about. It's about whether the black population should make a compromise like this, whether they should agree to just sort of be quiet and shoved into the background, or whether they should stand up and demand their rights as Americans and demand their rights as men. So this piece is really about the Atlanta Compromise and what everybody was asking for and what they might ask for instead. So, the other thing that I wanted to clear up is what these schools are that they're talking about. So, industrial schools are basically exactly what they sound like, kind of like trade schools. So instead of like higher education, the humanities, critical thinking, it's more like industry, how to work in a factory, how to build things, how to do things that are deeply useful and money-making. And the plus of industrial schools was that if you knew these things, you could make a bunch of money. And also that was somehow less threatening to the white investors. Because one of the things that was happening was that if they agreed that they would have these industrial schools instead of normal colleges, that they would get funding from white northerners. So in a sense, they had to be kind of unthreatening, kind of nice and soft, so that they could at least get a little bit of money. He also, over the course of the piece, talks about normal schools. And these sound like a kind of an interesting place to be, but really it's kind of like teaching colleges in which they taught people norms, or they taught people how to teach other people norms. So at first the teaching colleges were called normal schools. This is one of the most famous, the State Normal School and University for the Education of the Colored Teachers and Students, founded in 1873. And it was in Alabama, and eventually the town was actually named Normal, Alabama. So this university is still there, everything there, very normal. So hopefully that provides a little bit of background information on the Atlanta Compromise and what was going on in the like bigger educational scheme at the time. That brings us to the response to the Atlanta Compromise. And one of the things that DuBois wants to point out is that different people understood it differently. The South interpreted it in different ways. The radicals received it as a complete surrender of the demand for civil and political equality. The conservatives as a generously conceived working basis for mutual understanding. So, all compromises are, in a sense, like this. Generally speaking, in a good compromise, both people are dissatisfied at least a little bit. But what he's saying is that they viewed it super differently. So the conservatives were like, oh, isn't this nice? Isn't this peaceful? Isn't this exactly what we asked for? And the radicals were more like, isn't this some bullshit? So basically, the two interpretations were part of the problem. Another part of the problem was that nobody really wanted to criticize Washington because he was so important, and he was so vital to their community, and he was so well respected. Today, he stands as one of the recognized spokesmen of his 10 million fellows, and one of the most notable figures in a nation of 70 million. One hesitates, therefore, to criticize a life which, beginning with so little, has done so much. So he was the spokesman for his race, which is a lot of pressure. He was one of the most famous people in America, also a lot of pressure. And of course they didn't want to stand up and criticize this man who was so important and who was such a symbol to the entirety of the rest of his race. But there is, among educated and thoughtful colored men in all parts of the land, a feeling of deep regret, sorrow, and apprehension at the wide currency and ascendancy which some of Mr. Washington's theories have gained. Honest and earnest criticism from those whose interests are most nearly touched, criticism of writers by readers, this is the soul of democracy and the safeguard of modern society. So he's saying, even though we deeply respect Mr. Washington and we're deeply appreciative of all the stuff that he's done, it's vital that we be able to criticize our leaders. It's a vital part of democracy, it's a vital part of literature, it's really a vital part of holding people accountable. And he's saying, even though this is one of our most venerated politicians and statesmen and leaders, we still have to reserve the right to say when he's wrong. So that's another part of the whole problem, another thing that he's dealing with in this piece. He doesn't want to criticize Washington because they need Washington as a strong figure, but at the same time he has to criticize Washington because Washington is wrong about this. So now DuBois backs up to sort of examine the historical background of what was going on in this period in time. So he's going to talk about the presidential election and the voting rights and kind of what was going on with the black population. By 1830, slavery seemed hopelessly fastened on the South, and the slaves thoroughly cowed into submission. The free Negroes of the North, inspired by the mulatto immigrants of the West Indies, began to change the basis of their demands. They recognized the slavery of the slaves, but insisted that they themselves were free men, and sought assimilation and amalgamation with the nation on the same terms with the other men. So basically, not everybody who was black in America at that time was enslaved. A lot of people were free, and a lot of new citizens were coming over from the West Indies who also insisted that they were free, because they were. But basically what was happening was that just because they were black, they were beginning to be considered on the same level as the people who were enslaved in the South. So even though they were insisting that they had all these rights, they weren't necessarily being believed. The trend of the times, however, refused them recognition, save in individual and exceptional cases, and considered them as one with the despised blacks. And they soon found themselves striving to keep even with the rights they formerly had of voting and working and moving as free men. So even though they insisted that they were totally different, the white people were basically yeah, but you look the same. And so they insisted that they were the same. So people who had previously had rights of voting, of traveling, of working, were now seeing those rights restricted and those rights taken away because they were being lumped in with people they'd never even met. So what he argued was that they then had to push back. Here, led by Remond, Nell, Wells Brown, and Douglass, a new period of self-assertion and self-development had dawned. To be sure, ultimate freedom and assimilation was the ideal before the leaders, but the assertion of the manhood rights by the Negro himself was the main reliance. So they're pushing back. They're saying why are you taking our rights away? This isn't what we said we were going to do. So they're starting to push back and demand the rights that they had previously had, but it's not going well. And it wasn't helped by the next election. Then came the Revolution of 1876, the suppression of Negro votes, the changing and shifting of ideals, and the seeking of great new lights in the great night. So the election of 1876 was super contentious. Basically, it came down to one electoral college vote. And the Republicans in the North were running Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrats in the South were running this guy, Tilden. And basically what happened was that the Democrats agreed that the Republicans could win in exchange for taking all of their troops out of the South and essentially ending Reconstruction. So this was kind of dangerous to the black population because the troops that had been there were helping to protect their rights. and helping to enforce the end of slavery and helping to enforce basically the rise of the black population. And with the removal of those troops, the black people of the South saw that their rights were fading. And they were basically like, uh-oh. So when he says that this was like a revolution of 1876, what he means was that we were seeing the way that a certain segment of the population was treated being like drawn back into historical times, like that progress was being denied and they were being pushed back. And so he says this was kind of the setting of what was going on here, that basically their rights had already begun to be taken away again. And that brings us back to Washington, who was being asked to sort of settle this argument, to kind of keep everybody calm on all sides, which is a huge ask. Booker T. Washington arose as essentially the leader, not of one race, but of two, a compromiser between the South, the North, and the Negro. So basically, everybody was looking to Washington to settle this debate, to like calm everybody down. And Washington had some ideas about how to do it. Naturally, the Negroes resented, at first bitterly, signs of a compromise, which surrendered their civil and political rights, even though this was to be exchanged for larger chances of economic development. The rich and dominating North, however, was not only weary of the race problem, but was investing largely in Southern enterprises and welcomed any method of peaceful cooperation. So basically, they were seeing their rights taken away, but the opportunities for money were growing. And the people in the North were basically like, hey, we're tired of hearing y'all complain, but we do want to make some money from your cotton. So basically, if you can just convince these people to be chill, then we'll invest a bunch of money in you. But in exchange, you have to not be treated as people. Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission, but adjustment at such a peculiar time as to make his program unique. This was an age of unusual economic development, and Mr. Washington's program naturally takes an economic cast, becoming a gospel of work and money, to such an extent as apparently almost completely to overshadow the higher aims of life. So again, this is what we've been reading about all semester. The rise of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the working class, the idea that everybody could have a job and get paid for it. And so basically what Washington is trying to sell is, don't you want to get real paid? And what DuBois is saying is, yeah, but not at the expense of the higher aims of life. Like, of course, we're interested in money, this gospel of work and money, right? But we're not interested in it if it means we lose something important. So he goes on to say, in other periods of intensified prejudice, all the Negro's tendency to self-assertion has been called forth. At this period, a policy of submission is advocated. So previously, the idea had been we have to stand up, we have to complain, we have to protest. But now, suddenly, they're being told to chill, to submit. In the history of nearly all other races and peoples, the doctrine preached at such crises has been that of manly self-respect is worth more than lands and houses, and that a people who voluntarily surrender such respect or cease striving for it are not worth civilizing. So DuBois is saying, like, you know, over the course of history, every time that we see people give up their self-respect, even if they are getting something cool, we act like they've done the wrong thing. We act like they must not be a civilized population. We act like they must not deserve respect if they're so willing to give it up. And so he's saying, even though, I hear you, Washington, saying that we're going to get something out of this, we are not willing to give up our self-respect. And that's the really vital piece of this, that he has something that he believes is just not worth giving up. So DuBois returns to the question of the Atlantic Compromise, and what specifically Washington had in mind. In answer to this, it has been claimed that the Negro can survive only through submission. Mr. Washington distinctly asks that black people give up, at least for the present, 3 things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education for the Negro youth. And concentrate all their energies, instead, on industrial education, on accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation of the South. So basically he's saying this is what Washington wants. He wants you to give up these three things. He wants you to focus on industrial education, and he wants you to focus on conciliation, on being friendly and polite with the North. But Du Bois says that's not what's going to happen. If he asks for these three things, he's going to get these three results: the disenfranchisement of the Negro, the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro, and the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions of higher training for the Negro. So he says what you're asking for is going to result in some awful, awful things. So here is, a small chart to help us sort of better examine it. Basically, he's saying if they do what Washington asks, if they give up political power, what will happen is disenfranchisement. They will lose the right to vote. They will become disenfranchised citizens. If they give up their, claims of civil rights, their progress towards civil rights, they'll end up with a distinctly inferior status. If they stop asking to be taken seriously, they won't, and they'll just be considered totally inferior. And of course, they're asking them to give up higher education in exchange for industrial education, in exchange for vocational education. And he's saying they're asking us to really give up education, period. They're asking us to give up critical thinking. They're asking us to give up humanities. And that basically that's too much. Like, we are not going to send our children into the factories when we could be sending them to college. So basically he's saying this is what Washington is asking for, but this is what's going to happen if we actually do it. And these results are unacceptable. So now, once again, he backs up and sort of places his response in the larger historical picture. The question then comes, is it possible that 9 millions of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their exceptional men? If history and reason give any distinct answer to these questions, it is an emphatic no. So he's like, look, I have looked historically, and every time that people are asked to give up their rights and to give up their education, it doesn't go well for them. And even if you just think about it logically, that would be a terrible idea. So he's saying that instead, the only course forward is an emphatic no. And thus, Mr. Washington faces the triple paradox of his career. 1, he is striving nobly to make Negro artisans businessmen and property owners, but it is utterly impossible, under modern competitive methods, for working men and property owners to defend their rights and exist without the right of suffrage. So it would basically be impossible to be a business owner, to be an active citizen, if you can't vote on stuff that would impact you. How are you supposed to run a good business if you can't vote on, taxes and property laws? Those two things have to go hand in hand. 2nd, he insists on thrift and self-respect, but at the same time counsels a silent submission to civic inferiority, such as is bound to sap the manhood of any race in the long run. So instead of focusing on how to be a man and how to be an upright citizen, he's focusing on thrift and self-respect. He's basically saying, you should focus on being rich instead of focusing on being an equal citizen. And finally, he advocates common school and industrial training and appreciates institutions of higher learning. But neither the Negro common schools nor Tuskegee itself could remain open a day if it were not for teachers trained in Negro colleges or trained by their graduates. So he's saying basically, okay, so you want these industrial schools, you want these normal schools, who's going to teach there? Where are you going to get teachers if you don't have teaching colleges? Especially if you're going to have exclusively black colleges, which require exclusively black teachers, where are you going to get them? So he's refuting the way that these policies could work, and he's trying to sort of offer a historical background to demonstrate that, that's why these won't work. He also talks about the general response, the way that people are feeling about this. And basically he says that there are 2 reactions. And they range from kind of quiet disapproval to, rage. That basically people have either anger and blind hatred of the white people, or quiet but inactive disapproval. So basically, people aren't loving these policies. People aren't loving these ideas that Washington is putting forward, but their responses do range all the way from quiet disapproval to shouting in the streets. And he says that the way that they're reacting is pretty reasonable, all things considered. They're not asking for anything crazy. They do not ask that ignorant black men vote when ignorant whites are disbarred, or that any reasonable restrictions in the suffrage should not be applied. So it's not like they're saying, no, we want you to not vote, or saying like, no, we should make it way more difficult for white people to vote. They're saying, we want equal access. We're just asking for the same things you have. They are also saying that basically their condition is not a result of just them. Their condition is a result of larger social factors. They know that the low social level of the mass of the race is responsible for much of the discrimination against it, but they also know, and the nation knows, that relentless color prejudice is more often a cause than a result of the Negro's degradation. So one of the things we talk about all of the time is this idea that correlation is not causation. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying that like the low social level, the low level of wealth or of education or of political standing that is very common among the black population is not because they're black, it's because of this color prejudice. That basically this didn't come from nowhere, this came from policies that they were subjected to. And he's saying you can't just like be mad at people, you have to acknowledge why this is happening. So he goes on to say, they seek abatement of this relic of barbarism, not its systematic encouragement and pampering by all agencies of social power, from the Associated Press to the Church of Christ. So basically, stop being mad at people for being poor and uneducated when you made them poor and uneducated. And stop reporting on them as though they just invented this by themselves, and stop acting like this is the will of God, and instead, look at cause and effect. Look at the way that they are treated in the workforce. Look at the way that they are treated in the educational system. Look at the restrictions on their rights to vote. That basically, Mr. Washington's policies have a larger social impact, and all of the policies that we've seen so far have a larger social impact. So if you think that black people shouldn't vote because they're uneducated, you need to question why they're uneducated. Correlation, not causation. Always a good lesson. So now he returns to what he thinks they should do instead. This group of men honor Mr. Washington, but nevertheless, they insist that the way to truth and right lies in straightforward honesty, not in indiscriminate flattery, in praising those in the South who do well, and criticizing uncompromisingly those who do ill. So again, essentially, we can't just blindly swallow everything that we're handed. We have to look carefully at it, discriminatingly at it, and pick out the good parts and the bad parts. He says, basically, we're being reasonable. They do not expect that the free right to vote, to enjoy civic rights, and to be educated will come in a moment. Like, they're not saying they want this immediately, but they are absolutely certain that the way for a people to gain their reasonable rights is not by voluntarily throwing them away and insisting that they do not want them. So they want this, and they're not demanding it right now, but they are saying we have to hold on to what we do have, and we have to continue to ask for more. Like, we're not going to get it if we don't ask for it. Then he goes on that they must insist continually. Negroes must insist continually, in season and out of season, that voting is necessary to modern manhood, that color discrimination is barbarism, and that black boys need education as well as white boys. Man, this slide just breaks my heart, because we are still daily insisting upon this. We are right now insisting upon voting rights. We are right now insisting that black boys be treated the same way as white boys. Like, we are still messing with this. And it sucks. It hurts. The fact that, he said this over a century ago, and we are still insisting upon this, I think really shows where we're at right now. So anyway, in failing thus to state plainly and unequivocally the legitimate demands of their people, even at the cost of opposing an honored leader, the thinking class of American Negroes would shirk a heavy responsibility. A responsibility to themselves, a responsibility to the struggling masses, a responsibility to the darker races of men, whose future depends so largely on this American experiment. But especially a responsibility to this nation, this common fatherland. So historically we have referred to it as this American experiment, this idea of like, what does happen when you have a democracy with no aristocracy? And he's saying, if we don't take care of this now, if we do not like nip this discrimination in the bud, we are failing everybody. We are failing our fathers, we are failing our sons, we are failing the great American experiment. Because basically we have a responsibility to live up to what we wrote in the Declaration and in the Constitution, and if we don't, we are failing. So now he begins to address the concept of reconciliation. The growing spirit of kindliness and reconciliation between the North and South after the frightful difference of a generation ago ought to be a source of deep congratulation to all, and especially those whose mistreatment caused the war. So he's saying, like, look, we're not against reconciliation, like, that would be awesome. But if that reconciliation is to be marked by the industrial slavery and the civic death of those same black men, with permanent legislation into a position of inferiority, then those black men, if they are really men, are called upon by every consideration of patriotism and loyalty to oppose such a course by civilized methods. So again, like, reconciliation is on the table, but not if you take away civil rights, and not if you try to permanently legislate the black population into an inferior class. He says this isn't necessarily true of all of the black citizens or all of the white citizens, and that it's important to remember that these are people, and that they are not responsible for the actions of their fathers any more than you are. First, it is the duty of black men to judge the South discriminatingly. The present generation of Southerners are not responsible for the past, and they should not be blindly hated or blamed for it. None of us are responsible, for the actions of our grandparents. That's very fair. The South is not solid. It is a land in the ferment of social change, wherein forces of all kinds are fighting for supremacy. So he's saying, like, the South is not a monolith. These are not all the same. Like, not all of the people believe the same things. And that it's, in fact, a land that's undergoing deep and intense social change right now. Today, even the attitude of Southern whites towards blacks is not, as so many assume, in all cases the same. The ignorant Southerner hates the Negro. The working class fear his competition. The moneymakers wish to use him as a laborer. Some of the educated see a menace in his upward development, while others, usually the sons of the masters, wish to help him rise. So again, he's saying, like, look, not all white people are the same. They don't all want the same thing from us. Some of them hate us. Some of them fear us and our competition. Some of them wish well for us. And it's important to remember that they're not all the same way that we are not all the same. So he's saying we have to stand up for ourselves, but not blindly. Like, don't just assume that everyone is terrible, judge discriminatingly. In the final part, he returns to why Mr. Washington's propositions are so dangerous. It would be unjust to Mr. Washington not to acknowledge that in several instances he has opposed movements in the South which were unjust to the Negro. Like, he's done his work. But, notwithstanding this, it is equally true to assert that on the whole, the distinct impression left by Mr. Washington's propaganda is dangerous. It is first that the South is justified in its present attitude toward the Negro because of the Negro's degradation. Secondly, that the prime cause of the Negro's failure to rise more quickly is his wrong education in the past. And thirdly, that his future rise depends primarily on his own efforts. Each of these propositions is a dangerous half-truth. And this is a classic political tactic, right? To say something that's like half true in order to cast a light on it, in order to frame it as something that is different than what it might actually be. So basically, Mr. Washington, he's saying that this is kind of justified, the way that people think about the black population. Or that it's justified, the idea that they think that their education should be so specific and just industrial. And Du Bois is saying, no. These supplementary truths must never be lost sight of. First, that slavery and race prejudice are potent, if not sufficient, causes of the Negro's position. Again, you can't consider these things in a vacuum. The amount of slavery and race prejudice is heavy. Second, industrial and common school training were necessarily slow in planting because they had to await the black teachers trained by higher institutions. Again, can't teach if there aren't any teachers. And third, while it is a great truth to say that the Negro must strive and strive mightily to help himself, it is equally true that unless his striving be not simply seconded, but rather aroused and encouraged by the initiative of the richer and wiser environing group, he cannot hope for great success. So yes, it's important to strive. Yes, it's important to work hard. But you could work hard all day without success if people are not ready for you to have success. So it's just going to be you rolling the boulder up the hill forever unless people are willing to admit that you are rolling the boulder up a hill and you're working hard and you're doing a good job, and to let you finish rolling the boulder up the hill. So he's saying, like, you're not entirely wrong, but you're kind of wrong, and it's important to address the larger social structures, to address the slavery and the prejudice and the lack of teachers, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. So he goes on. In his failure to realize and impress this last point, Mr. Washington is especially to be criticized. His doctrine has tended to make the whites, North and South, shift the burden of the Negro population to the Negro's shoulders, and to stand aside as critical and rather pessimistic spectators. So this was a neat trick, right? To say, like, look, everything that's wrong with you is your fault. And then to stand back and be like, hey, why are you dealing with that so badly? And so Du Bois says we have to do better. When in fact, the burden belongs to the nation. And the hands of none of us are clean if we bend not our energies to righting these great wrongs. The South ought to be led by candid and honest criticism to assert her better self and to do her full duty to the race that she has cruelly wronged and is still wronging. So if half or part or a third or even like 1% of the population is being held down, that is the whole nation's problem. You can't just stand back and be like, hey, why don't y'all do better? You have to help. You have to have candid and honest criticism, and you have to assert your better self. You have to acknowledge what's wrong, and you have to work to fix it. And then he brings it all home. By every civilized and peaceful method, we must strive for the rights which the world accords to men, clinging unwaveringly to those great words which the sons of the fathers would fain forget. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we wrote these words down, if we act like they're the most important thing in our country, we have to uphold them. We have to live by the words we said we were going to live by. So Du Bois's final point is, we just want you to live up to the Constitution and to the Declaration and to the things that you said were important. And that's a pretty fair point. So that brings us to the end of Du Bois. I hope that this made sense. This was certainly the most times I have ever said the word Negro in one day. It was weird for me, but it was historically accurate and in context, so I hope you'll forgive me. But if you have any questions, as always, send me an email, and I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one with you. I'll see you soon.